Here. Good evening and welcome to the latest in the Humanities Center at Texas Tech's Forest Speaker Series events for spring 2021. I'm really happy to have you out tonight on Zoom to be here for Tree Law, a panel hosted by Vickie Sutton with our special guests Bill Tripp, Keith Hirokawa, and Blake Hudson. I'm Dr. Michael Borshuk. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English and the director of the Humanities Center at Texas Tech. I'm going to make just a couple of quick announcements before I turn things over to our MC for the evening. First off, I would ask that you mute your microphones while our panelists are speaking tonight. We will have plenty of time for Q&A after their presentations, so we encourage a fruitful discussion afterwards after they have had a chance to present their work and talk about some of their ideas. Also, coming up, we have just one event left in the Forest Speaker Series before we bring what's been a really exciting year-long program to a close. I encourage you to register for our event on April 22nd, that's Earth Day, the final panel of the semester, Thinking Like a Forest, Cities as Living Systems, with Don Danby, David McConville, and Andy Lipkis. Like all of the events we've been hosting this semester, that's at 7:30 p.m. Central Time, and you can register for that at the Humanities Center's website, humanitiescenter.ttu.edu under the Events tab. I also encourage always at all of our events to keep track of what we're doing by following us on social media. So that's Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and you can see events that we're hosting. We'll be planning and announcing events fairly soon into the spring for next year's theme, which will be anti-racism. So if you follow us on social media, you can keep track of events as we announce them and any other activities that the Humanities Center is sponsoring here at Texas Tech. I also encourage people always to check out our monthly podcast, Humanities Now, which features different conversations with humanities faculty here at Texas Tech about their research. The very first episode that we launched back in September was all about the forest theme with the programmers for that theme. You can find Humanities Now on all of your major podcast directories, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, etc. Finally, before I turn things over to tonight's Master of Ceremonies, as always, I would like to read the Humanities Center's Land Acknowledgement Statement. The Humanities Center at Texas Tech opens its officially sponsored events with an acknowledgement of the indigenous people on whose lands we host our talks and gatherings. The center opens its events with this gesture as part of our commitment to respecting the shared humanity of different populations across diverse cultural traditions, and to remembering with clarity the complex and violent truths of our history. With that in mind, we acknowledge the sacred grounds on which we stand, the traditional homelands of the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the Comanche Nation, the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma, and the Mescalero Apache Tribe of the Mescalero Reservation. We pay respect to their elders past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, trauma, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. At this time, I would like to turn things over to our host for the evening, Dr. Bruce Clark, my colleague in the English department. He is the Paul Whitfield Horn Distinguished Professor of Literature and Science, and he is the head programmer of all of the forest programming this year. So as I've done many times tonight, I'm going to turn things over now. Okay, Bruce.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Vickie, so much for taking the lead on setting up this panel. And thanks for everyone who's come out tonight. I just want to take a moment to put this event in the context of the wider Forest series, that this is the next to last meeting. It's really been a wonderful, wide-ranging set of presentations, and tonight is no different as we move into the realm of the law. But let me just provide some remarks before I introduce tonight's panel. So throughout fall 2020 and spring 2021, the annual theme of the Humanities Center at Texas Tech University has been forests. However, in light of the raw wounds fresh in memory from recent months and weeks, you may well ask, why forests? Why pretty trees and tranquil forests when there are so many more pressing matters to be concerned about, so many atrocities and injustices, so many communities torn apart by senseless acts of violence? With next year's annual theme of anti-racism, the Humanities Center will renew its commitment to advocacy for social justice in human communities as we look for ways to redress white supremacy's pervasive violence and systemic persistence. But for the moment, I personally want to suggest that another prejudice, which we may call speciesism, that is human supremacy, human exceptionalism, is equally pernicious. The same level of unjustified violence we humans inflict upon our own kind, we have also been inflicting upon the non-human world, with too little cognizance that the wounds we inflict on the body of the earth and on our non-human planet mates ricochet upon us as well in the end. I think these issues are all of a piece then, and one may just as well shout out, stop the killing on behalf of the forests, as well as on that of our fellow citizens. We think that to be fully human and truly humane at this moment also requires a greater understanding of what it means to be of this earth. We humans are not the masters of, but one of the countless participants in living communities, bound up with, enmeshed along with the least of these living beings in the earth system. In relation to this realization, the profoundly entangled life of forests demonstrates in close-up how the earth system at large, call it Gaia if you like, must be held intact to maintain the conditions that keep all life going. Thus, we're delighted to sponsor tonight's discussion of tree law and to engage these timely and pressing issues of legal standing and jurisdiction as the non-human members of our community clamor ever more justifiably for rights and representation. As we'll learn, tree law covers a broad range of concerns from the public management of forest ecosystems to private management of trees and urban subdivisions. The philosophical grounds for the legal protection of trees will be explored in light of the classic paper by Christopher Stone, Do Trees Have Standing? Unlike science, the force of law is confined by jurisdictional boundaries, and sometimes plural legal systems overlap and conflict, as in the traditional management of forests by the Karuk Tribe in California. All these issues will converge in our panel this evening. So it's now my honor to introduce tonight's panelists in the order in which they'll speak. Blake Hudson, Samuel T. Dell Professor of Law and the co-director of the Environmental and Land Use Law program at the University of Florida Levin School of Law. Professor Hudson's recent research has focused on the intersection of land use law, policy, and planning with natural resource management, with particular emphasis on the role of forest management in combating climate change and the implications of land development for long-term natural resource management. His research is also centered on the commons and the complicated role of private property rights and government institutions as solutions to commons dilemmas. Next, we'll hear from Keith Hirokawa, Professor of Law, Albany Law School. Professor Hirokawa's scholarship has explored convergences in ecology, ethics, economics, and law. Professor Hirokawa practiced land use and environmental law in Oregon and Washington, and was heavily involved with community groups and nonprofit organizations. Professor Hirokawa studied philosophy and law at the University of Connecticut, where he earned his JD and MA degrees. He earned his LLM in environmental and natural resources law from Lewis and Clark Law School. And our third and last speaker tonight will be Bill Tripp, Deputy Director, Ecocultural Revitalization for the Karuk Tribe. I hope I'm pronouncing that reasonably okay. In the Karuk Tribe's worldview, planetary stewardship is maintained through the place-based spiritual and cultural philosophy of world renewal. Bill Tripp is a Karuk tribal member and deputy director of ecocultural revitalization for the Karuk Tribe Department of Natural Resources. He's a specialist on forest management and was co-PD on the USDA, NIFA, AFRI Food Security Project. He's also the lead author on the Karuk Ecocultural Resource Management Plan. Okay, so now I'm going to throw it to my colleague, Vickie Sutton, who will be the primary moderator as we proceed tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. I appreciate that. We're co-moderating tonight, and I think we'll both share in asking questions later on. But I want to welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here. And thank you to our panelists who are part of Texas Tech now. Even though you're not physically here, we're really glad to have you. And with that, let's get started. So welcome, Professor Hudson.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint okay? Is that a yes or no?
Yes.
Everybody see it? Okay, okay, all right, good, good, good. I couldn't see faces there. Okay, so my name is Blake Hudson. Thank you for the chance to be here. Even if it's virtual, I'm very appreciative of Professor Sutton for reaching out. It's good to see fellow friends here and be able to be on a panel with Keith and see Bree and others. So I'm going to just do a kind of a soup to nuts approach on just giving you an overlay of forest management in the US, a 30,000 foot view, talk about some of the emerging threats to forests, and then I'm going to finish with a discussion of some potential responses that are not necessarily policy driven. Well, they have links to policy, but that are market driven, potential emerging trends and emerging issues to look out for as we think about how to manage forests going forward. So I'm interested in forest management. The picture that you see behind me here, the virtual background, this is actually some property that I grew up on in South Alabama. It's about 1,000 acres of timberland. My son and I were just there 2 months ago flagging some trees so that they would not be cut. And then we went back and there was a cut of about 53 acres done because the tornadoes from a hurricane came through and knocked down about 60% of the timber, and we didn't want it to just sit there on the ground. And so, but to get that out, the companies had to take the standing trees out, but we're going to reforest it with some longleaf pine ecosystem, which was the original ecosystem that existed in the region. So we've got some NRCS grant money, federal money that we're working on to restore some habitat on 53 acres. So growing up here, you see some more pictures of our property there. It really is a living laboratory for the things that I write about, the things that I teach about private forest management. So it's a really, really cool thing to be able to have something so tangible in the areas that you practice in. You can see here kind of the dividing line between the hardwood part of our forest, kind of transitioning into the timber, pine timber part of our forest. And while the hardwood is prettier, really what you see on the right there is what historically the southeastern US looked like because of fire that really kept the hardwoods down in the watersheds. Only because of fire suppression policies do you see all the hardwoods up on the highlands in the southeastern US today. So that gives you a sense of what that looks like. But you know, forests provide obviously so many different services for us: renewable building materials, paper products, biofuels, jobs, also clean air services. They filter and trap air pollutants, clean water services. They prevent nutrient, chemical, and other non-point sources of water pollution. Flood control services. They obviously provide species habitat, regulation of local ambient air temperatures in urban and rural areas, energy cost savings for businesses and households. and then aesthetic, spiritual, and cultural values as well, and recreational values. So how are forests divided up? A lot of people don't realize that the United States is the opposite of the rest of the world. Most forests, I believe it's something like 85 to 86% of forests globally are owned by governments. In the US, 60% of forests are privately owned, and 35% are owned by the federal government, with another 5% owned by the state governments. And so you see the private ownership here in the yellows and oranges and reds, and then you see the public forest in the blue. And so you can see the Southeast there, where I'm from, which is what I write about mostly, is about 86% privately owned. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about federal forest management, but obviously you know that the federal government on the primarily western forest lands is facing a number of issues related to specifically fire management, particularly fire management. And I bought a piece of property about 8 acres up in Colorado that backs up to the San Isabel National Forest, and it was shocking because it literally across the fence is the National Forest. And when I walked up in there, I was just shocked at all the down fuel, the fuel loads on the floor, all the aspen and ponderosa pine and fir trees that were down. It was a very unhealthy forest in that sense. And you really start to understand the problem. In the Southeast, a tree will last about 3 years on the ground, and then all the microbial activity and fungus and everything else, just in the humidity and all, just decays. It decays, right? But out west, those fuels build up. So that's an issue that's obviously being faced by the federal government, particularly out west. But the states face some challenges as well, and particularly in the southeastern U.S. So in the southeastern U.S., there was an interesting study done by Ben Kishore and Constance McDermott about different types of forest policies that you might have, some legal tools to manage forest resources. And some of those policies are procedural, so requiring that forest managers have certain plans in place, and some are substantive. You see the types of substantive standards that you might have laid out here, the 5 types of forest policy. Riparian buffer zones, those are rules that say you have to leave 20 to 30 feet of trees along a stream to provide buffer so that there's no erosion and protect stream temperatures for fisheries and things like that. Road decommissioning, culvert sizes at stream crossings, clear-cut limits or prohibitions on clear cutting, or maybe crown cover requirements that you have to leave 50% of the crown whenever you cut, reforestation timeframe, stock levels, and things like that. So they basically came up with this matrix to say procedural and substantive, whether voluntary or mandatory or prescriptive. And they did this assessment, and they ranked the states around the United States, and they compared them with other regions of the country and the world. Or other countries. And you see here that on their 1 to 10 scale, Alberta and British Columbia, New Brunswick, California, and the U.S. Forest Service scored a 9. Some other Canadian provinces an 8. Oregon had a 7. Idaho 5. Alaska 4. Louisiana and Virginia came in strong for the South with a 2, and the rest of the southeastern U.S. got a 1. And you say, well, why is this? Well, in the southeastern U.S., there are no prescriptive forest management regulations. So in California and the state of Washington, Oregon, even in some of the states in the Northeast, you have a requirement that you have to leave 30 feet of trees along the watershed, or else you'll be penalized. You'll receive a fine. In the Southeast, all of those regulations are voluntary. They're voluntary best management practices in the southeastern U.S. So there's no calling up, and like what happened to us when our neighbor cut the trees all the way down to the stream bank and then it eroded and damaged our land. There was no calling up the Forest Service to say, hey, go find them for this. There was no legal recourse except to bring a nuisance claim, which is a really difficult claim to prove for causation issues, and you have to have resources to hire lawyers to do those types of things, and those wasn't anything that my family could afford. So you've got this interesting dynamic in the U.S. Now in California, Oregon, or Washington, Kishore and McDermott found that there's this public spillover effect where whenever you have higher percentages of public lands, like 50% in Washington State or more, then you're going to have higher state regulation of private lands, or more prescriptive regulation of private lands. And that's because, think about it, most of the voter base is not privately owning forests. Your body politic is made up of a very different constituency than in Alabama, where 90% of the forests are privately owned and they don't want to be prescribed, the rules prescribed for them. And so it's a very different, for private forest lands, there's a very different dynamic playing out across the different regions of the country. And I'm particularly concerned about the Southeast. There was Keith's getting so tired of hearing this. There's this report that I cite in every paper that I've ever written about the U.S. Forest Service projects that over the next 50 years, the southeastern U.S., just the southeastern region, which produces more timber than any other country in the world, could lose up to 13% of its forest land. And that's all of the forests in the state of Alabama, right? So that took me a long time to do that with Microsoft Paint, because I'm too cheap to buy better photo editing software. But this is a NASA satellite image of forest cover in the U.S., and that's how many trees we're talking about losing out of the Southeast if trends continue. And you say, and that's a problem, because if you look at, and this is a little bit older, some of my charts are a little older in here, but probably not quite as high, maybe 16% or 15% now, but there's some estimates that forest degradation and deforestation have resulted in up to 20% of carbon emissions every year. I mean, it's so more than the transportation sector. So if you think about all those pipes and smokestacks coming out of, or the pipes coming out of the back of cars all around the world, more carbon dioxide is released into the environment through just cutting down trees than all those pipes, which is really, really remarkable. So it's a problem when you have deforestation in a place like the southeastern U.S., much less in the Amazon and other places. They're so critical. Why? Well, this is part of the reason. Part of the story is rapid development, land use, unchecked land use. You know, we see this in Florida now. I never thought one type of sprawl could be so much superior to another type of sprawl until I moved from Texas to Florida. But at least the sprawl in Florida, they put trees in the parking lot, whereas in Texas, or at least around Houston, they just pave everything. And so, you know, but development is a big driver of this, that's causing issues. You know, one interesting, and I know I'm keeping up with my time here, but you know, we've been here before though. Okay, so a lot of people don't realize the history of, I recommend a book called The Slain Wood, by William, oh come on Keith, what's his name, he's at UCLA now, he was at Colorado, anyway, The Slain Wood, William Boyd. And it's this fascinating story about how there was crazy deforestation in the southeastern US at the turn of the century, the 1900s, early 1900s. At any point in time, the state of Georgia only had 25% of the trees that you see today. So it was cut over. There were all these perverse tax incentives that caused people to go out and have what they called annual woods burning. So basically they'd have a big party and get drunk and go set the woods on fire, because if they didn't, they would be taxed for the value of the timber on their property. So there was just, it looked like a war zone. And so what happened after the turn of the century was a lot of federal interest in southern forests, a lot of acts passed at the federal level. There was even proposals during the Roosevelt administration to prescriptively regulate southern forests at the federal level, right? So private riparian buffer zones on private lands and clear cut limits and things like that at the federal level. That would have been an interesting law to have seen come about. There was even there was a William Bankhead, was a Southern senator, who actually proposed that the federal government buy all the forests in the southeastern U.S. It became such a problem. And so, and you can see here a picture of kind of what a typical Southern landscape like at the turn of the century. And so what turned it around? Well, what turned it around, and I guess my images didn't come up here, but my words, but what turned it around was markets, investment in the southeastern U.S. It was the pulp and paper industry came in and they changed they lobbied to have some laws changed to provide some certainty, and then they actually encouraged the regrowth of forests in the southeastern U.S. And so the story of the rebound of forests in the U.S. South was really a market-based story, and a lot of people don't like to hear that because they think, how can, you know, it's not the natural forest if it's a crop or whatever, but it's better than this. It's better than fields, open fields, right? And so, and frankly, a lot of people don't realize that the monoculture pine plantations that you see today, as I mentioned earlier, really reflect what the southeastern landscape looked like 700 years ago, much better than what we consider a natural forest in the oaks and magnolias and all the other trees that you see from the hardwoods that really used to be confined to the watersheds until we suppressed fire. And so let me talk about some emerging markets that might help or trends that might help with this issue. One is wood pellets. You see the wood pellets here. You've probably seen them or people who are familiar with up in the Northeast, they use them in their stoves and things like that. You've had the pulp and paper industry close mills over time, and you see here the average annual change. That's only through 2008, but it's actually kind of continued and leveled off a little bit. But you see North America and the loss of pulp and paper mills. You see here the paper mills lost is in the gray there. That's going down over on the right. But we've had wood pellet operators come in on, as you see in the kind of orange on the right there, to kind of fill the gap. And renewable wood has become a discussion in renewable resource for energy. It still only makes up a slight sliver. You see the blue here of the total amount of forest product that's pulled out of the forest in the southeastern U.S. So it's not become some major stripping of southern forests to have these wood pellets. But what wood pellets are is they're like in England, they're replacing their coal-fired boilers with wood pellet-fired boilers. And so there are benefits to that in the sense you don't get all the co-pollutants, the same co-pollutants that you do with coal. Coal is also fossil fuel, which is, it takes a long time to recover that from the atmosphere, whereas trees, theoretically, you can recover those over much shorter time frames. We're going to talk about some of that in a minute. There's been various studies showing a reduction, a GHG reduction compared to gasoline or other fossil fuels, both in transport fuels like cellulosic ethanol, and also in from electricity generating plants. You can see here biomass, taking into account the life cycle for reuptake through reforestation. Now, there's been some controversy though, and I've written about this a good bit. Controversy in the sense that a lot of people are concerned. They say, well, you're still putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We need to be doing solar and wind and hydro, and you know, we don't need to be cutting down our trees. There's two different perspectives. One perspective is it's going to take so long to recoup that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that we're going to pass some climate tipping point before we do. The flip side argument is that no, when you manage at a landscape level, you're gaining those benefits now. You could actually expand forests onto currently unforested lands if you had a robust market for people to put their timber into. And so there's some debate on that. I tend to find that some of the people who I really admire, like Bill Schlesinger at Duke, Nicholas School, or Emeritus, they kind of cherry pick certain data, like, oh, it takes 100 years to recoup this carbon dioxide. Well, a pine tree in the southeastern U.S. takes about 18 years to recoup, you know, once you cut it and pelletize it or whatever. So it's not as dire, I don't think. And the thing that I've been trying to get people to do, I only got 3 minutes here. The thing I've been trying to get people to do is to think about what happens if you don't have a market. And a lot of people like to think that if you don't have a market in the southeastern U.S., it's like public forests. They're just going to stay forests. No, they're not. They're going to turn into strip malls, and they're going to turn into soybean farms. And because the states are not going to prescriptively regulate forests in the southeastern U.S. anytime soon. And so if you don't have markets, then you're going to end up with no forests. And my point is to say we need to start taking into account potential conversion of forest to non-forest uses whenever we think about the carbon balance, because it may very well be, it may not be, but it may very well be better to have forests that some of which are utilized for electricity generation than to have no forests at all. Because at the end of the day, it is a renewable resource, and it can encourage the protection of other values like water quality and species habitat and so on and so forth, especially when you're only cutting these forests on 20 to 30 year time frames. And so, here's kind of the green line shows you what theoretically the closed loop of using forests. So you get a carbon dioxide sequestration dividend that goes down, and then you cut it and it goes back up to a baseline, and then you get it again as you grow new trees and it goes down. Whereas the coal or fossil fuels you see are one-time emissions into the atmosphere that you never can recoup. That's the perspective of some people. These are some of the pellet mills that have been taking place around the country. You see the map here of some of the places that pellets have been expanding. Here's a port in Baton Rouge. When I worked there, they put these pellets on the ship and they send it over to England, and that's where they're burning their fuels. And clearly, it may be a bridge thing because clearly, solars can be better. Though you have to think about the materials that go into making the solar. Solar and wind can be better. But as we saw in Texas, a lot of these facilities obviously weren't winterized. But another thing is, what do you do about peaking situations where you're going to peak peaker plants and whatnot? Biomass is the only fuel that you have that is quantifiable in the sense you know exactly how much you have, and whenever peak demand goes up, until you get battery storage power for for wind or solar, you know exactly how much you have to put on and burn in order to meet your demand. And so it provides some other benefits like that. But that's a market that could potentially help. I've got 10 seconds here. The other one is mass timber. 3 things about mass timber. The International Standards Organization has said we can double the height. I think it's 18 stories now out of wood. It actually burns less than steel and concrete because the wood soaks up the fire retardant much better. And so the idea here is that you might cut some timber down, which the market encourages people to replant the timber. There's a carbon sequestration benefit there. And then you store the timber in these buildings. That's carbon sequestration in the buildings. And then you displace the use of steel and concrete, which is a very carbon intensive products to produce. So there's like a 3-fold benefit to that. That's another emerging trend in the area that could help us think about how we manage our forests in the US. Okay, sorry. 44 seconds over.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Hudson. We've decided to hold questions until the end, so I think we'll go right to our next speaker. Thank you very much. And I do have questions. Professor Hirokawa, welcome.
Thank you. I always have a hard time following Blake because he provides an awful lot of information and I provide very little. And so it's a rough one to follow. And I do appreciate being invited. It's quite an honor to be here. And it's a really nice introduction as well, including from Professor Clark, who, making reference to speciesism and some of the very difficult challenges we have in how we conceptualize our relationship to the land. It's very difficult these days. Probably not more difficult than before, but we're certainly asking tough questions these days and challenging some of the anthropocentrism that pervades not just our social thinking and philosophical thinking, but one of the things that is a little problematic for my talk today is that anthropocentrism is really the only game in town when it comes to law, right? And so I was asked to talk about whether trees have standing. And it is, you have to ignore the fundamental question, right, of whether trees can have standing in a human-based legal system to have a really good conversation about it. So what I thought I'd do is hopefully get a conversation going. But in the meantime, look at some of the reasons that trees don't have standing and how we might think around that problem a little bit, right? And I think largely we can start at the question or start at the observation that our legal system just doesn't show a lot of respect for trees, or at least not in the ways that we might think about trees if we want there to be standing for trees. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that came to be. Think about some of these different social constructions of trees and legal constructions as well. And then maybe try to get into thinking our way out of this problem, maybe towards standing or maybe just towards something that we can build on from what Blake was talking about and from some of these ecosystem services and what that might have to offer. So to get started, right, sort of laying this baseline for what we're talking about, and what we do know is that trees have significant spiritual and cultural and personal and institutional and economic value. Right, we climb on trees, they shelter us, they feed us, they provide building materials. Sometimes we might even find an old oak tree and tie a yellow ribbon around it for a show of affection. And if you know the reference that I'm making here, then you're at least as old as I am. We talk about famous trees, right? Bodhi tree, the 9/11 survivor tree. We celebrate them in Arbor Day, and we have them as symbolic, and such as Christmas trees as well. And what's a little confusing is with all of this celebration, all of these cultural meanings, that when we look at the law, we really realize that the one pervasive element of the law is that there's not a lot of respect for trees in the law. We could get there, right? We could have respect for trees in the law, but we really don't right now. And so that's what we have to talk about. So I'm going to get into some of those legal dimensions, right? Some of what Vickie had asked, some nuts and bolts of tree law. And we're going to try to figure out what that means on the way and see where that leads us in terms of understanding what that legal construct might be. So to start, we really have to grasp the idea that trees are considered property, right? And this is a challenging thing to think about, as we'll see in a little bit. But before we get to the challenging parts of this, we have to grapple with this, right? Trees are not just property in and of themselves, but trees are often considered part of the real estate on which they grow. They can be severed from the land, right? We can convey a profit, a prendre, which is a right to take natural resources from the land. But short of that, they're considered attached to and part of the real property and owned by the underlying owner, right? And this is why if the power company or telephone company wants to trim trees and get the branches away from your power lines past your property, they have to ask for permission, right? Because without consent, that would be a trespass. So ownership of trees, right? It secures this power, it protects this interest, but ownership is also the source of controversy, right? I mean, this is what you get when you start giving people rights to exclude others and protect stuff by claiming this is mine and hanging their flag on it. In some cases, really leads to some pretty odd behavior. I'll bet we've all seen stuff like this. One of my favorite cases is Warnke versus Hallis. And this is also known as the case of the hanging toilet bowl. Right, so this case started with a tree that grew across the property boundaries of three neighbors. Right, it sat on a corner, and three neighbors' property lines had some part of this tree trunk. And this is pretty common. What happens when a tree straddles a boundary line is we have a co-ownership situation. In a concurrent ownership situation with a tree, each of the owners has the right to do management so long as that management doesn't threaten the health of the tree or other property. In this particular case, the neighbors just couldn't work it out. They couldn't figure out how they wanted to manage this tree, if the tree should stay or go, if they should trim the branches and some such things. Now, if you have siblings, or if any of you have tried to share property before, you realize that it could be a real nightmare. And what happened in this case is it devolved for, people decided that this wasn't really about the tree, but they just hated one another. They put up construction fencing at the property boundary to annoy each other, started up with the obscene graffitis at the property line. And then eventually toilet bowls were hung up 20 feet in the air facing each other's neighbors, portions of which were painted brown. The defendant in this case, when called to task for the toilet bowl, said it's not actually a toilet bowl, it's just a really ugly bird feeder. So, one of the things that we see in these co-ownership problems is it's not about the tree at all. It's really about where the tree is, right? And it's we don't care about the health of the tree, the situation of the tree. What we really care about is what is mine. And this is a pretty good indicator, right, of how the law goes in this area. So now that's not to say that trees aren't the actual controversy instead of just what incites controversy. But what we know is trees grow, right? They won't stay little, much like puppies and children. They grow and their branches and roots reach out and they intrude in other people's property, right? They cross boundaries. Their branches, they get wide and long and they grow fruit and leaves. And as most of you were probably aware, this can cause problems too. Oh, and roots too, by the way. I'm sure some of you have seen this. When roots grow and they disrupt sidewalks and people trip and fall, and this is a pretty big source of litigation as well. But because law thinks of trees as property, what we spend time talking about in these cases is how to allocate responsibility, right? Who has the rights and who has the responsibilities with regard to these growing trees. So cities and landowners in general have duties to prevent foreseeable harm from falling branches and falling trees. Trees that grow across a boundary line can be considered a trespass, or as Blake was suggesting, we could have a nuisance situation, which is a little tougher of a case in these to win, but nonetheless, we can think about these because they're in somebody's control, that in some situations it's an act for which liability will arise. And the typical remedy for these, which is kind of interesting, is self-help is the most prevalent one, the right of the victim to engage in self-help and trim those branches that intrude upon the property line. And it's different in different states. In Massachusetts, the property owner, the owner of the tree itself doesn't have any duties, really, even when they cause harm. And the only remedy is self-help. In contrast, in Hawaii, self-help is not available to that neighbor unless there's a proof of an imminence of harm. So there's some variation across. But again, when we're talking about tree law, we're at least on a personal level, private level, we're really talking about liability, rights and responsibilities. In addition, right, trees can be owned to the exclusion of others. Nobody has to allow other people to climb on their trees and swing from their branches and some such things. They can be subject as property to theft and trespass themselves. And the laws of many states even recognize special damages such as treble damage for the theft and sometimes the damage of trees, such as in a timber trespass situation. So that's trees as property. I didn't sum it up great, but I think I got enough on the table so you can think about this is really responsibility, liability, and in large part, probably to prevent more hanging toilet bowls and some such things. So sometimes it gives rights and other times tree law gives duties to avoid harm to others. What in law we use the Latin sicutre tuo ut alienum non laedas, don't use your property to hurt somebody else. And that sort of sets the baseline. Okay, now, so what about injuries to the trees themselves, right? This is the big question about standing for trees. And so I thought to get into this, I want to kind of back my way into it. And I was thinking that if somebody cut off my arm, I can imagine what my claim of damages might be, right? There's pain and suffering, maybe lost wages over time, medical expenses, and just those damages from me knowing that my arm has been cut off. So recognizing that's not the same thing as the way we think about damages, right, to trees. And why, right? And the reason, of course, is because what we're talking about is trees as property, and probably that trees don't suffer, legally don't suffer those same kinds of injuries that we think of in occurring in humans, right? So to get into this question, right, we mentioned that this is maybe a jurisdictional question, maybe a standing question, and maybe just a way of crafting what trees mean. And so maybe the way to ask this question is access to justice, right? What does a tree have to do to get justice when the tree's been damaged? And so I was thinking that this might be a little bit odd way to approach the question, but we could start by asking, how do we get justice against a tree? And of course, every time I say that, I giggle a little bit because it sounds a little silly coming out of your mouth. But before you find the humor part of it, you have to remember that this is a question that would have been very important to Charlie Brown. And if you don't know this reference, I do apologize. But Charlie Brown tried so hard to fly a kite. He wanted to get it up into the sky. And as it turns out, he couldn't do it. He never did. And the reason is because the kite-eating tree. This doggone tree would not let that kite get off the ground, and repeatedly, not only damaged his formative development years, Mr. Charlie Brown, but also caused personal property damage. And so the idea of getting justice against a tree, maybe in a cartoon might make sense, but there are certainly situations where you hear, right, branch falls on teen in Central Park, let's cut all the trees down in Central Park. And in a way, I suppose that could be a way of thinking about justice against a tree. But it changes a little bit when you start thinking, if this question says, would we punish a tree for bad acts? And I promise you, I know some of this stuff sounds a little silly, but it's really not, right? These are the questions we have to ask to understand how a tree might enter into the legal system, and would we punish a tree for bad acts? And this is beyond the general, let's say, criminal intent requirement for most crimes. This is just a question of whether the penal system or any of even the civil punishment types of ideas would apply to a tree. Say, for instance, deterrence. We could try to punish a tree with a deterrence idea behind it, but I don't think that's going to keep the tree from taking down Charlie Brown's kite next time. So maybe we wouldn't sue a tree, right? Maybe it wouldn't actually make any sense to do that. So with that in mind, we can turn this back around and say, okay, well, maybe a tree can sue. Maybe a tree can have standing, let's say, for pain and suffering. And this is the reference that was made earlier to Christopher Stone's piece, and actually series of pieces about whether trees should have standing. And he did a fantastic job of thinking through the idea that a lot of not exactly human entities, although human entities can sue, even though they don't have some of those characteristics that we might want of a litigant in court. For instance, babies, right? They're human, they can't. And we let them have their day in court by a representative. Corporations don't have personhood, but we let corporations sue entities that we allow to have access to court through representation to make sure that they have their day in court. And so then we have to ask, well, are trees any different than any of these other things? And maybe, right? Maybe they're different, maybe they're the same. But what we do know is to date that what we haven't seen is non-human entities, at least in the United States, having any legally recognizable injury to bring to court. We have seen rivers in New Zealand having standing to sue. We're starting to see some rights of nature appear in constitutions in South America. But certainly in the states we have, and it might be interesting just to ask why that might be. So this is, at least to date, no United States cases that I'm aware of. I could be wrong about that. And Blake, I'd love to be corrected on this because it'd be a lot of fun to have that conversation. But no standing for trees in the United States courts, certainly not to sue humans for damages done by humans. And we often entities for damages been done, for instance, dogs suing other dogs for damage and some such things. Now, that said, there are some pretty creative examples of how this might play out if we took the idea seriously. And one of my favorites is in Georgia, the tree that owns itself. Some of you may be aware of. The tree that owns itself came up in a 1935 deed. The mayor of a town in Georgia deeded to a tree that had a lot of significance to the town, been through a lot with the stem, but deeded to the tree and branches and trunk to have and to hold itself, its branches, limbs, trunk and roots as long as it shall live. That tree has since been replaced, and in the later iterations of this deed, the deed has also included the underlying land for the tree. So now this tree not only owns itself, but the land that it lies on, or at least according to the deed. And this is fascinating, right? It's converging with this movement of rights of nature. And this is where we have to turn. I think in one way of thinking about the idea of standing is whether we can codify some rights in non-human entities that gets them into court. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest with you, what these rights of nature might mean, at least in our legal system. And I think it might be worth talking about. And I certainly don't want to undermine the idea. But I think a couple questions might be relevant to putting some of the values at issue on the floor. Right. So let's say we gave rights to the tree, such as the tree that owns itself. And this tree decided that it wanted to be, and people may grasp this biblical reference, but it wanted to be a treasure chest or a boat or even a child's cradle. If this tree decides it wants to be transformed into one of those things, do we restrain the tree? If we do restrain the tree, does the tree get its day in court? And how does that happen? And more specifically, though, we have to ask what those sorts of rights might be. I mean, we can certainly imagine at base, we're talking about a right to life, a right not to be property, right? Those seem like basic considerations of this right. But then we might extend it a little bit to try to test it and see where it goes. Would trees assert a right to privacy, for instance, or a right of reproduction, a right of free speech, and some things that we enjoy under the Bill of Rights. And some of this makes a lot of sense because we're very comfortable, right, personifying other non-human entities, including trees. You're thinking back to like Shel Silverstein's very popular book, The Giving Tree, right? This really complicated story that on the one hand teaches our children the values of selflessness and maternal behaviors, while also showing how we can take advantage of kindness. It's a little bit complicated, but what we do find is this tree acting in ways that we can understand as it interacts with us. We do project these human values, right, onto non-human entities. And it's possible that that would be a route to getting to rights of nature. Right? The problem is that has been very poorly received in the courts. And there's one case where a landowner sought damages for his tree's pain and suffering after that tree collided with a Chevy, with a car. The tree was not at fault. The tree was not moving, just so that we're all on the same page. But there was a collision and there was some damage done. The court found this idea so fantastical. And for those of you who want to know or are interested, this is Fisher versus Lowe. It's a fantastic case from Michigan in 1983. But the court found the idea of the tree's pain and suffering not a fantasy, but fantastical nonetheless, and dismissed the case in a poem. And this doesn't happen very often, but I have it here to read to you because this is a court out on its limb, so to speak. We thought that we would never see a suit to compensate a tree, a suit whose claim and tort is pressed upon a mangled tree's behest, a tree whose battered trunk was pressed against a Chevy's crumpled crest, a tree that faces each new day with bark and limb in disarray, a tree that may forever bear a lasting need for tender care. Flora lovers though we three, we must uphold the court's decree. And the case was dismissed because the court couldn't figure out what to do with it, how to calculate those damages, how to think about a tree and pain and suffering and understand where that claim might come from or what the damages might do to repair the situation. Now, this stands in stark contrast to, at least in Washington, where a timber trespass victim can not only sue for the timber trespass, and treble damages from it, but can include emotional distress for the loss of trees in that claim. So we're very far apart in terms of that personification idea to get to standing. And it does illustrate the idea that the kinds of injuries that we're prepared to see in court are really ones that are felt by people. I'm way over my time already. I do apologize for that. So I'll try to sum up, and then maybe some stuff will come up in questions at the end. But I wanted to just maybe at this point finish on, there's a gentleman by the name of Timothy Luke, who's a political scientist, and he had this idea of eco-managerialism as one of the sources of the problem. And it's really interesting because it links up with property law. One of the ideas of thinking about why we don't respect trees is because we've made them property. What Luke added to this was it's not just that property law maintains this distinction between what has access to justice and what doesn't, but we train our future professionals to further instill those values, right? So our foresters, our natural resource managers go through the training to make sure that value is seen as economic value. We train them in sustainability kinds of constructs that show that even if what we're looking at is multiple use sustained yield, it is always economic yield, probably first and foremost. And that's why our rules come out that way. What Tim Luke's position was, even where we're talking in conservationist types of ethics and rhetoric, what we're really doing is making sure the next generation of environmental managers is prepared to keep tree as resources, as a pile of things that have to be used. So I do apologize for taking more time than I was allowed, and I'll be happy to take questions after.
Thank you very much. We are going to try to stick very close to our 9 o'clock time when we wrap up, I think. So we'll just to put things into perspective, in Western legal traditions, we've seen that forests are managed very differently than individual trees that are privately owned property. And now we're going to take a look at traditions that are indigenous to America and how that fits within these Western legal traditions by using traditional ecological knowledge with our next speaker. So, Mr. Tripp, welcome.
Yes, I was at the end. Okay, Ayuki. Karuk people are among the last indigenous groups contacted in the lower 48 states. First contact for the Karuk did not occur until the early to mid 1800s. Though the last recorded arrest for indigenous burning is purported to have occurred in 1932, that is also when the Forest Service claimed success in stamping out the pure customist class of renegade whites and Indians, which they were known for taking a shot at them when they were running around in the brush, starting fires like a coyote. The Karuk family still use fire for many reasons on small scales. Some of these uses include continuance of our ceremonial prayer fires involving world renewal, healing ceremonies, or for personal medicine and resource enhancement. The combination of human factors and changing climate we currently face is our call to return our indigenous fire use systems back into landscape scale practice. Western science is now starting to see the human correlation with changes in how fire has behaved on a landscape. The study compiled by Taylor in 2016 uses tree ring studies, charcoal, and pollen sediment cores to identify humans as a primary driver of fire on the landscape. As this graph representing Sierra Nevada forest shows, the fire system as statistically stable until the arrival of the Spanish, when fire use increased significantly. This period is followed by the gold rush and finally the fire exclusion period, which period created by fire suppression policy. What further validated the human relationship to fire from this study is that in the Klamath Mountains, where Karuk territory lies, the shift started 40 years later, not from Spanish influence, but from Hudson Bay fur traders. This difference raises many questions, including the legal force and effect of the California Indian Land Claim Settlement Act when it comes to many Northern California tribes. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and deadlines imposed regarding associated settlement of claims may simply not apply. Oh, that picture's not showing up. However, not being an attorney myself, today's message is more about Indigenous stewardship as a driver of fire systems. Removing Indigenous influence on fire over vast landscapes has had profound effects. We don't know everything to expect of the future, but we do know that we need to address the effects of predicted vulnerabilities. The increase we are seeing in high severity fire, along with the declining species populations we are seeing, along with the unrealized sovereignty promised, places the Karuk in a unique position to look at climate change as a strategic opportunity. An opportunity not so much to adapt to a culture of evacuation, recovery, response, and loss of water, plants, animals, traditional foods, medicine, and fiber resources, but rather an opportunity to revitalize our Indigenous knowledge, practice, and belief systems and restore our relationship with fire. In the Indigenous approach, human relationships are often key to success. We have been building these relationships over the past 26 years, but now more than any other time in our history, we are aligning our federal, tribal, state, and NGO strengths to overcome our weaknesses. And as partners, we're filling the voids to get the job done in alignment with the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. There are indicators that as the polar ice cap melts, the persistence of high pressure systems over the west may increase the number of critical fire weather days. We are already seeing greater impact northeast wind events aligning with wildfires adjacent to our communities. Minimizing negative consequences is all we can do at this point in managing for the unknown. We need to pay attention to the changing weather patterns, disease and pest infestation, species distributions, associated climate stressors, as well as the impacts that these things may have on air, water, plants, wildlife, and people. We cannot do it alone, nor can we count on our predictions to be true in all cases. When I was a small child, my great-grandmother taught me to use fire for the right reasons. She told me that though she didn't know how much people may have changed the climate trend, if they didn't affect it too much, we should be seeing the beginning of the next ice age in my father's lifetime. She reflected upon the premise that though the situation may seem dire, the good news is that the natural trend wanting to be on a cooling trajectory would give us little but some time to fix our relationship with fire and implement other measures needed to once again work with nature again instead of against it. That said, Indian country is in a unique position to lead in the climate adaptation equation. as we are the forever people of our geographic and biological systems. This is Karuk territory. As with most indigenous territories, the context is unique. The diversity of species and complexity of the landscape, along with its location, compared to a shifting jet stream and coastal influence, show evidence of its potential resilience as a climate refugia. We have knobcone pine and brewer spruce growing so close their crowns nearly touch. These two species are on both ends of the spectrum when it comes to their fire tolerance. One needs it to reproduce, the other is easily killed. In one place, there are 17 distinct conifer species located on 1 square mile. This place has always been a climate refugia, as indicated in its climate memory, or in its landscape memory. We work to fix the world in our Aboriginal ceremonial practices. And starting to fix the world in a contemporary context, we have established a process to collaboratively develop all lands NEPA CEQA compliant planning documents. We're focusing on merging the old with the new. We're using the stories, knowledge, and expressions of our indigenous cultures to build the foundation upon which we take the hard look under environmental policy law. We're establishing replicable models of success and sharing those with others who wish to adapt them. Wish to adapt with their unique place-based situations. Simply translated, we made the call for the restoration and maintenance of resilient communities, ecosystems, and economies. We also identified fire-adapted communities, healthy river systems, healthy diverse forest plants and animals, restored fire regimes, including cultural burning regimes, sustainable local economies, and community and cultural vitality as our primary set of shared values. The principles and practices of Indigenous stewardship is the foundation that we're building upon. To formalize our collaborative relationship, we established the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership and identified a 1.2 million acre landscape for planning area. Using the open standards process for collaborative conservation, we're demonstrating how we can work together to conceptualize, plan, implement, research, monitor, reassess, and adapt our management actions through time. These actions are founded in Karuk knowledge, practice, and belief systems. We have begun implementation of our first collaboratively developed NEPA document for the Sonesbar Integrated Fire Management Project. Socio-political issues in Siskiyou County and the Klamath National Forest continue to be difficult to navigate. So our Happy Camp and Salmon River projects have gained no traction. I might add that Happy Camp burned up last year, over 100,000 acres in less than 24 hours. But on the Six Rivers National Forest, we have achieved collaborative engagement, strategic alignment, and are gaining greater alignment on our collective program of work every year. We have closed out our first interagency agreement for the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership effort and have completed 2 collaborative NEPA documents that began at the point of conception based on our prioritization overlay assessment. We have a new 5-year agreement signed and have initiated a 10-year master stewardship agreement. Implementation is well underway, but barriers to prescribed fire remain very prevalent. We are currently planning a project aimed at restoring conditions conducive of reinitiating annual ceremonial burning practices on Off-Field Mountain, a project that last occurred in 1911. This is our indigenous peoples burning network landscape. As we gain success in our WKRP efforts, we wanted to expand our efforts to partner with neighboring tribes. As we all know, if you don't get along with your neighbors, there's trouble to be had. Though discussing the hard lines between territories can create friction, we all have fire in common. We do share a similar ceremonial and resource use practices despite being from three different distinct linguistic groups. Together, we're working to bring the potential for family-based burning back into reality as we build our support networks to get fire on the ground for the same reasons that we have for millennia. Burning together at the right times in the right places for the right reasons will get us to where we need to be through this change. And it can help us transfer the principles and practices to others who want to learn and burn with us. We are opposed to become the first indigenous-led, prescribed, and or cultural burning training center in the Western US. Perhaps the most critical of our climate adaptation efforts is in regards to revitalizing our relationship with the animals. Our traditional stories tell us that we used to be able to speak to the animals, but they quit talking to us when our human condition of overuse, abuse, and neglect of living systems took over. This led to bad things, and we had to observe closely in order to learn from the animals how to behave right in our ancestral homelands. The animals are still there, though many are in decline, and we are moving into an era of accelerated extinction. This can be attributed back to the same reason for the animals turning their back on us in our stories. It is time we re-engage in upholding that responsibility to them, and if we do, they can teach us how to manage properly once again. When it comes to habitat and species-specific adaptations and looking at animals such as the Pacific fisher, one can see here that it is at the scale of multiple ecoregions that this species once flourished. These are the scales at which the biocultural relationships of people and nature need to reemerge. How do we protect and reconnect these pockets of current range and begin to enable repopulation? As one of 5 initial focal species selected in the Snows project, the Pacific fisher is a regalia species that carries the arrows used to wake up the earth in our annual world renewal ceremonies. It has a territory of about 25 square miles for a single male, and its habitat dynamics are representative of the requirements of many species occurring on the landscape. Since the northern spotted owl also occupies a component of this habitat and is a regulated species, it was also selected as initial focal species, even though it's not represented as one to focus on in Karuk culture. These species represent cool, dense climate refugia type areas in an era of increasing temperature and high severity fire as their primary reproductive habitats. Other species with initial focus are elk, willow, Pacific giant salamander, and the Pacific giant salamander to represent open space, healthy riparian areas, and pure clean water. Our traditional ecological knowledge related to these species serve as a reason why we should actively manage under this set of principles that once maintained a healthy environment for all species of our ecoregion. However, current law, regulation, and policy tend to have a single species focus, which can then create more barriers than solutions. We need to be solution-oriented and focus on interconnectivity of species and habitat dynamics, not blanket rules of strict no action and avoidance. Managing for focal species and habitat is a critical focus, but one cannot look at all species at once. Our comprehensive capacity as humans will simply not allow it. We can, however, transition away from a structure and composition focus and look more to ecosystem process and function as our primary guide. Processes like smoke interaction with air temperature, water temperature, evapotranspiration, water quality, and salmon out migration become critical correlations. Karuk culture places harm to the Pacific giant salamander as an indicator of poor water quality and reaching the verge of complete ecosystem collapse. We witnessed this during the July complex a few years ago, when over 800 salamanders were counted as dead, along with exceedance of 15% mortality in the spring salmon run in the Salmon River subbasin. There was no snow that year. The feedback loop that followed was a lightning event that started many fires in very dry conditions. These fires burned so hot they created a pyrocumulus cloud that started 22 more fires between the town of Sawyer's Bar and the Oregon border. This became the Happy Camp Complex, one of our worst fire years on record prior to this last summer, that is. However, the water temperature did drop, flows increased, and die-off stopped within 3 days. These predictable factors raised the question, could we have done some prescribed burning to create this smoke and stop this die-off as a planned mitigation? Could we have changed the uplift dynamics enough to change where the imminent lightning event occurred? The Karuk Tribe signed a letter to the president asking to declare a state of emergency, calling for exactly that, but decided not to send it when the July complex started. There are known indigenous fire management practices associated with the hunting grounds that are related to these factors, as well as those shown in this graph. Ceremonial burning in June, August, and September once regulated these processes, keeping our occupied salmon habitats at or below stressful levels. It is easy to see water temperatures reach lethal levels just before the ecosystem feedback loop creates lightning to enable this cooling function to occur. We managed these cycles in the past, and we can again if our sovereign authority to do so can be recognized. Over 51% of our WKRP planning area burned in at least one large fire. It burned at least once in large fires between 2008 and 2018. We may now be too late to just put fire back into the 2008 fire footprint and expect positive results, but fire will burn there again on our terms or not. But to start, anything that has burned in the past 9 years needs to be burned again, and soon. Of course, smoke creates health impacts, but how do we weigh those against safety of our community from megafires and unmanageable conditions, or even health impacts associated with eating traditional foods and exercise from gathering? Our forest foods need fire to proliferate, as do indigenous peoples. Food security is what links people to place and responsibility for sustainability of the natural environment. This figure shows some of the food web linkages that connect human behavior to focal species. Without fire, huckleberries fill in under the canopy to the point that you can't even walk through them. Mesification occurs to the point where it is hard to burn without killing the overstory trees. With fire, the huckleberries produce berries for humans and birds. They produce seeds for rodents to eat. The tree produces food for large ungulates, humans, and small mammals. The huckleberry also provides cover for the rodents and for the elk, protecting the young from wolves. If we wait for wildfire to do it for us, we may not be happy with the consequences. Without fire, there's no access to any of these, and we all suffer from starvation and predation, which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service identified as the primary threat to the northern spotted owl. We all need access to an abundance of locally produced healthy foods. Humans, animals, fish, plants, and animals alike. This principle poses a means to weave our relationship to species into the balance of health consideration, including that of modifying smoke policy and regulations. If we can't produce smoke, we cannot burn. We cannot have access to healthy and abundant foods. If we cannot have frequent fire, our safety, if not our ability for survival in a supply chain disruption or wildfire situation, is in question. It's important to note that frequent fire at this scale is better than 4 months straight of smoke at this magnitude. But the smoke in this picture is exempt from regulation. Why are our indigenous fire management practices not exempt? They are a valid and previously existing right. When there's critical infrastructure, then there is critical infrastructure. Intense storms create flooding, microbursts cause blowdown, changes in wet snow elevation bands cause snowdown. Extreme wind events from the northeast occur during critical fire weather conditions, contributing to increased electrical ignitions from utility infrastructure. Human starts are more likely along roads or in recreational areas. Combining high winds with electrical infrastructure starts are proving in California to be disastrous. 200 homes just burned in Happy Camp last summer, killing 2 people and putting half of our administrative office staff in a homeless situation in the middle of a global pandemic. By treating around structures along roads, ridges, strategic water courses, and even within infrastructure corridors, burning in favorable fire weather conditions allows for short duration, low intensity fire. This also reduces burnable fuels in the event of a later wildfire. Ensuring these areas are treated, burned, and maintained at the scale of all overhead rural electrical infrastructure in the community, you can start to make meaningful difference. Not to mention create a value-added outcome and correlating funding source for establishing program longevity. Now the utility company is a funding partner, hopefully one that helps to build endowed investments and eventually shift the financial burdens away from their shareholders. To make this all work, tribal program capacity needs to be built. All our facilities space is full. It is difficult to sustain action when you don't fit into base funding formulas due to the inability to recognize territorial sovereignty over the ancestral land base. Funding the people who can solve the problem is a more logical approach than basing recurring funding allocations based on a color on a map. We need to utilize and expand upon new authorities such as the 2008 Farm Bill related to Public Law 93-638, contracting, and the principles of self-governance. To make this all work at the territorial scale, there are many capacity needs. We have built some capacity and we have relied on the strengths of some of our partners, but there are many skill sets missing. We have been successful in getting grants, but when one critical position goes unfunded for a grant cycle, it sets leadership capacity back to picking up the duties and trying to find backup funding. Ideally, these activities could be compacted, but the fact is, even with new 638 contracting authorities for Forest Service programs, There are issues around liability and risk aversion that get in the way. The current system compounds barriers when it should enable cumulative solutions while promoting ecological integrity. Here on Black Mountain, we used to burn every year in August. People lived in permanent houses, but they didn't burn down. People spent their entire lives paying attention to the plants and the animals in these different vegetation assemblages. Areas managed for different cultural vegetation characteristics based on soil types, elevation, aspect, and other factors and they have different seasonality for burning. The sequence of these burns can play upon themselves to create the fuel limited system that once enabled large scale fire use in a non-threatening manner, even during northeast wind events. Which brings us to climate adaptations to strengthen tribal sovereignty. Fire has been taken from us without due process. Treaties were signed but not ratified. There was no contact with Spain, so the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and correlating land claim timelines in the California Land Claim Settlement Acts do not apply. Revitalizing our relationship with fire and its associated benefits to the water, the fish, the animals, the plants, and the people is what will enable us to survive a changing climate. Hopefully with the majority of species currently residing in Karuk territory remaining intact. Recognition of territorial sovereignty will be critical to our ability to succeed, even if it just starts with shared decision making. When conditions are right in the dormant season, we need to burn under the oaks. When native grasses cure, we need to use the black established under the oaks as a fire control feature. Timing this right will promote native species and work to eradicate exotic invasive species such as star thistle and Medusa headgrass. When the moon is at a certain stage, we need to light our ceremonial fires. When other indicators present themselves, we need to be able to act accordingly. Our traditional indicators are not all identified in our climate adaptation plan. It probably tells more than our elders would like for us to have said, but it does not tell enough for a complete co-opting of our cultural responsibilities. It is time to operate under tribal priorities, build consistent and reliable funding sources, and help lead people back to being part of nature as opposed to being apart from it. Most importantly, it is time to truly revitalize our indigenous knowledge, practice, and belief systems for transference to future generations. Investing in technological tools and indigenous academic knowledge holders, as well as our general practitioner base, will be critical to making this a reality, as will addressing liability issues. Insurance companies are quickly backing out of the prescribed fire arena. I'll close with a question of my own. Why should indigenous people be held liable for something that would not be if fire was not taken from them? Doctor.
Thank you very much for that. I think this was an epic panel, definitely, and thank you so much. I'm because we're close to our time limit, I'm going to ask a very short, quick question of everyone. And Professor Hudson, if I could get you first in order. Like in the 1900s in the Southeast, where we had these perverse policies that led to destruction of the forests unnecessarily, do you think there are any policies today that have perverse effects or unintended consequences?
Ooh, that's a great question. I actually do, and I'll try to keep this short. I don't think there are, well, except for omission, right? I don't want to give the impression that I don't want the Southeastern U.S. I want the states to regulate forests better. I want them to have clear-cut standards and riparian buffer zone standards. It just makes sense. So don't hear me. I'm just so bathed in the political reality of the kind of state legislature system right now that I'm skeptical that that'll take place. So there's omission. That's perverse in my view, not regulating. But let me just give you one example of local regulations that I think are causing a lot of harm. In Houston, Texas, I had a colleague who owned about 100 acres of timber. And as you all know, Houston is expanding faster than the universe, it seems like, because there's no land use control in the city or surrounding areas. And they actually have a law that says, a tax law, not it's kind of ironic considering that was what was perverse in the early 1900s, that once the development around your timber gets to a certain level, your tax rate triggers to the highest and best use of what it could be, right? So, and that's not the technical legal language, but basically, if there's development pressure around your 100 acres of forest and you were paying $2,000 a year in property taxes, maybe running it as a farm or something like that, they're going to tax you at what it would be taxed at as if it were a mall or some other development, which makes people's tax rates go up sky high. And then what choice do they have but to sell for development, right? And that's perverse. That's causing, especially in the urban areas where we need to be keeping core ecosystem services near where people are. That's one example of a policy that I think is causing a lot of perverse incentives to cut down forests when they should be preserved.
That's good to know. We're still lots of work to be done then. Thank you very much. One of the questions that with stones, do trees have standing? I think that I wanted to hear from you, Keith, is if you would appoint a legal guardian for a tree, for example, what could go wrong?
What could go wrong by appointing a legal guardian for a tree? So it depends on who you ask. Richard Delgado wrote a piece back in the 80s arguing that the trust idea is fundamentally flawed because a human trustee will always be influenced by the constructs in which he or she operates. And in all likelihood, it'll be ecocentric, sort of ethnocentric, and it will be everything except ecocentric, right? So, and the argument has appeal. I personally think that the human imagination is a little more productive than that. But you know, the dilemma with the and when you're saying what could go wrong, I mean, I think, you know, having somebody speaking for the trees, a trustee, is a heck of a lot better than just leaving it up to the properties. And personally, I think, you know, we talk about, you know, a representative in a sort of public trust doctrine kind of way of having these trustees, and all we, you know, in some situations we have that, but for the most part, what we're looking at is, you know, nonprofits that are looking for environmental quality, achieving environmental quality against what the threats are, which may be environmental quality or might be environmental quality standards that are conceived in reaction to what they perceive the threats to be. So certainly that could be a challenge of making sure that what we're doing is prioritizing from an ecocentric perspective rather than a reactionary perspective about a particular kind of development. I think one of the things that you heard Blake talking about is an awful lot of change in policies and you know, a constant moving target as to what would constitute healthy forest practices over the last 150 years. You know, our environmental law standards have evolved in that fashion, right? Depending on who's in political power and who's arguing against it. And so that's the challenge, right? Is, you know, our human or, you know, our very social oriented kind of perspective on what needs to be done has enough different kinds of influences that we might, you know, miss the forest for the trees and some such things. I don't know if that's answering your question good enough. I mean, it's a very challenging question, right? Is objectivity better than subjectivity? Is a very complicated question when it comes to acting as a trustee on behalf of somebody who you know doesn't speak your language. complicated.
Yeah, well, that definitely gives us something to think about for sure. That it doesn't sound like it's impossible, though.
No, it's not.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's encouraging. Professor Clark, do you mind if I ask my last
No,
question?
listen, there's nothing sacrosanct about 9
Okay.
p.m. As long as people want to stick around and discuss, we can keep going. I think, Mike, is that, would you agree? I mean, Mike's the head man here. But no, please, Vickie, why don't you just continue with your questions? I've got a few in my head, and I'm sure other people would like to join the conversation. So let's just keep going.
All right, I think we have some questions in the chat as well. So, Mr. Tripp, thank you very much for that presentation. I noticed that your territory has an international boundary through it as well, which could be really challenging for legal traditions, Western legal traditions. What I wanted to ask you is, could you tell us about the barriers that you have, for example, when you need to get a permit, a burn permit, but you have to time it with the moon and you have to time it with the ceremonial timing. Do you have any problems with getting permits from the state or local government when you need them for those purposes?
We haven't got to the point to where we are operating within those state and federal sanctioned systems and aligning that with our indigenous timing. We're trying to get there, and we as a tribe don't ask for permits. We don't believe this is a permissive action. It's our ancestral right, and so that's a benefit of partners. Is you can actually get out there and do something within the established legal frameworks. You just have someone else apply for the permit. That way, you're not abrogating your authority to make your own decisions under the principles of self-determination and self-governance, self-determination.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you have worked around that that issue. That's good. All right, Professor Clark, I will give it back to you. And if you want to go to the chat for any questions.
If I could follow up with Bill Tripp, I'm wondering if our new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, gives you any hope that policies are going to change that will help your situation.
She does. I hope I can get an audience with her here in the next few years. There are some indications that show that may be entirely possible to do. She just released a statement just today, turning around a bunch of the Trump era rules in the Klamath Basin that were working against us because they were done out without consultation, and that they're going directly against the standing policies of the new administration. So there are a lot of promising indicators coming forward in that potential relationship.
Well, let's hope you can regain some sovereignty and put these practices into effect, at least as an experiment, if not something that has long, tradition of success, ready to go back into operation. Let me just say, for those who are still with us, you're welcome to unmask and unmute and pose any questions or comments that you would care to. Anyone out there? Please come in.
Hi. Thank you. Have we lost Blake? I don't see him on the call anymore because
He
I
must have had a
Yes,
9
he had to
o'clock
go.
get it.
bedtime.
I get it. So I do have a question for my friend Keith. And, it's really just a comment, and I want to see how it really fits with your analysis of standing. And then also toward the end of what you were talking about is how do we educate our professionals to either better value trees and the idea of forests or better understand them. So I think back to the book that Peter Wolleben wrote, The Hidden Life of Trees. And The Hidden Life of Trees it's based on science, but it talks a lot about a tree and how a tree is not just a single entity or an object, that trees are actually very communal, that they communicate with each other underground through fungal filaments. They warn each other, they protect each other, they do it through the air. And so they exhibit this communal existence, which is almost human-like in a way. So of course, when we think about standing, you mentioned it's very anthropocentric, right? And we look at injury and redressability and all of those things. I don't know if the author goes as far as saying, well, trees have feelings, but certainly if you look beneath the surface, trees are very communal and they exhibit these characteristics that could be attributed to humans. And so I'm wondering, number one, how would that play into a standing analysis? And number two, perhaps the reason why we have forest management and people working in the industry who place a certain value on the tree is because we don't have a deep enough understanding or knowledge of the science and the understanding of how trees are really this communal entity. And had we started this education earlier, would that change the value that we place upon this resource?
Wow, what a question, Bree. So just so that you know, Bree was supposed to ask me a softball question, but that was a little more complicated.
It is.
So this is a great point, right? Because what I was giving you was a very limited analysis on what the potential of personification might be to get trees into court. But a different way of thinking about it certainly would be, as we do for every other entity that has access to courts, is instead of trying to figure out how they fit into our perspective and our values, try to recognize the kinds of values that they would otherwise want to protect. And if it's community-oriented values and even communities, it makes a lot of sense that we could figure out how to integrate that into the legal system. Where I usually go with this is a lot different than that. But, what Blake was talking about, and a lot of the work I do is on ecosystem services. And the reason I like the idea of ecosystem services is it changes the conversation from, this commodification, this resourcification, this idea that it's not the best use of a tree is to cut it down and turn it into a bunch of board feet so you can go build some stuff. It's the only use from the resourcification perspective, right? And so what we look at with ecosystem services is recognize all of these ecosystem processes that every entity in the ecosystem engages in, and the way that we track these benefit flows into things that humans really value. And so the unfortunate part is it's still market-based. We still need to figure out some kind of economic market-based valuation for it. The awesome part about it is it's not the resourcification part that is valued, right? It's all right because it's all non-use value. What's the use of the tree that is intact and in place and doing what it's supposed to do to humans and everything else, perhaps, but it's the human value that we can calculate. But what we're looking at there is the value of non-human use of the things in the ecosystem. So it does change the conversation. I think even though we're trying to find that valuation that puts it on par and apples to apples instead of apples to oranges comparison for that commodity version of value versus everything else. But what it doesn't do is give the kind of value that might get us into court, right? And I think that's what you're getting at. These ideas of how environmental law is supposed to be objective is still always objective as to the kinds of things that we value or prioritize as humans, right? And so, getting out of, and what I really do think is this, propertization of all the things in the world that keeps us from recognizing all of these other aspects of what could be protected and what, nature needs, and some such things is really problematic. But, right, so what would a legal system look like that doesn't ignore all of the things that are valuable that the trees need and are engaging? And I think what I might be pointing out, and certainly one of the most important things of why environmental law hasn't done what it's supposed to do, is just an informational problem, right? It wasn't until 1969, effective in 1970 with the National Environmental Policy Act, that anybody cared about having information before we went and cut everything down and dug a bunch of holes, right? And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but NEPA was revolutionary, even though it's merely procedural. The idea of having information about the ecosystem before we changed it was such a big deal. What we're seeing these days is, even in OMB, but we're seeing in all the agencies, of recasting both the process and the substance of the information needed to make a decision. And right, so taking NEPA to the next level in every aspect of every decision, rather than just the stuff that we can argue about, in a couple of weeks before giving somebody a permit to mine. Really deep dive stuff, water budgets for groundwater, just to figure out if we should dig a well. I mean, this is so much different than we used to do things. Thinking about hydrological connectivity, right? Even one drop of connectivity between surface water and groundwater, and factoring that into every decision, just to build a driveway, to compact the soil, because we know that's going to change the direction of groundwater. This is pretty significant stuff. Trying to rethink what we are scared about with invasive species, recognize that in a climate justice framework, we're going to have so much ecosystem migration that it's going to be fundamentally different anyway, and maybe losing the fight against invasive species isn't the right way to frame that question, right? So all this information that we're gathering now that we've never really had before, our first and second generation environmental laws were not based on, is going to make a big difference in how we address, communal values, in a particular grove, or the entire system. If we want to take that, sorry, I know I'm just kind of babbling at this point, but one thing that I think is really cool is some of the developments in the last 10 years in the geoscience and geosystem analysis is recognizing, that this ecosystem services idea is so doggone limited because it only looks at the surface and barely scratches topography and thinking about how ecosystems work and how they relate to other ecosystems. Once we expand vertically, not just horizontally, the analysis of what we're looking at, and when we talk about the critical zone in geosystem sciences, we think about the bottom of the water table to the top of the canopy. And when we realize that we're talking about atmospheric services, geosystem services, and ecosystem services across the landscape, we get a really good picture of the kinds of interferences, interruptions with these processes that are really big deals that just nobody had the time or really the legal mandate to pay attention.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. It's a pretty broad issue.
Yeah.
And starting at NEPA means there's a lot of territory to be covered with that question, definitely. Very broad statute, by the way. Thank you for that, stab at that question.
Thanks.
Yes.
So if I could jump in and tie some of this together, I think Bree's right on the money and got Keith on a really good riff, ending up with the critical zones concept, which is it's systems thinking we're talking about. We need systems thinking, and choose your system. An ecosystem at least models the integration of a multi-species complex. And we saw Bill show us beautiful examples of the local ecology, where the forest is the immediate zone in which the huckleberries and the salmon and the salamanders are all part of the same web that that needs to hold together for everyone to thrive. And so this is a model then for a community-based approach. And of course, Bill's indigenous milieu models as well a commons sensibility where value is not derived from the private economic benefit of property holders. So we've got to move the laws. we got to get some better legislators, I would say, as part of the legal issue here, and start with the kids. I like that too. I mean, I think somewhere that's happening if they let, if good ideas are allowed to be presented to the youth, we might make some progress on this.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And just to tie that in with The Secret Life of Trees, that was, I believe the documentary that came from that was the subject of our first panel. So good tie-in.
Yes, and Voleben does say trees have feelings. Now,
Yes.
he's pretty far out in the thinking there, but he has some science to back that up. I wish Blake was still here because I don't know if you people know a band called the Flatlanders, but they're from Lubbock, Texas. And I have this obscure live concert CD of the Flatlanders, and they've got a song there called Setting the Woods on Fire. And I always thought it was just a metaphor for going out and getting drunk as hell. But now I realize it's like got this historical, it was actually about these parties they would have. I've got a research project in front of me looking at, where did that song actually come from? But wow, how far we have come from senseless destruction for a perceived benefit that really just didn't, whatever benefit came was just momentary and not well distributed, to the cultural practices that Bill presented us with, which actually create value, create ecological value that redounds to community prosperity. So that's my rant.
Good tie-in. Do we have any questions from anyone out in the audience yet?
We've got a question in the chat, I see.
Yes, in the chat. Would you like to read that?
Sure. Question for Mr. Tripp. Seems there's much to be learned from indigenous stewardship and fire suppression practices. To ensure that these practices are of value, I assume they would need to evolve to meet changing environmental conditions. If so, could you describe if and how traditional indigenous practices change to meet a changing climate and environmental degradation that's being witnessed on indigenous lands in the Northwest of the present day US?
Well, a lot of our things like our meteorological sciences are kind of tracked based on our current calendar that we have these days, which makes it kind of seem a little odd to folks. But if you actually look at it from the perspective of a lunar calendar, those weather systems still are on track and the same timing. And so though the impacts of some of the weather events that might be associated with the burning practices might be a little bit more extreme, and that we've got, 100 years plus of additional fuel loading in place that would make the fire behavior a little bit more extreme, we still have those windows of opportunity in that time to reestablish that practice, and more importantly, the principles behind the practice. And if we don't do it, we're sealing the fate for the environmental degradation that we're seeing from these mega fires to continue. And you look at the Slater fire that happened up in Happy Camp this year. It was an ignition that happened on the northeast side of town during one of those northeast wind events, and it blew right down into town within a matter of an hour or so. And the name of that place in Karuk language translates to place where Hazel Creek flows through. Well, those lower to mid elevation slopes on the southwest facing slopes like that would have primarily been populated by black oak trees and pine trees, kind of intermixed there with the conifer, with the Douglas fir and those other kind of species, kind of more on the northerly slopes, which would be sheltered from the insulation values and the emulsification effects of those particular species, would protect them from not only from those types of events, but in having an in-depth fire use practice, a very frequent fire use practice within a 2-mile radius of that village or that community. You would be burning off those black oak leaves in February and March, and the one day of sun in February, you burn the pine needles. It creates a black line for when you go burn the black oak leaves, 3 days later, and on and on and on. Each soil type, each aspect, each little change in that moisture gradient as you move through the year, burning for different reasons, in different places, helps fit that whole season, that whole sequence together. And it was the socioeconomic drivers that changed that. Everything on that northeast side of town is conifer plantation, or was conifer plantation, and so it was spotting 2 miles out, because that would only burn in the worst of conditions, and so it was that socioeconomic driver that caused that fire to be so impactful. So we look at it more from the socio-ecological resilience first approach, and and if we can build the endowed capacities for the baseline jobs in the workforce, and your recurring costs, then your tax revenue is based on a different economic model. It's not based on an extraction principle. And then you get the added benefit from your foods and fiber, traditional food and fiber resources that could then be sold in a co-op. So you could still have an economic component and have a commission off of that co-op feed back into the endowment, so it can grow and you can expand and you can do more farther out. And so there are ways to change. You're not going to, if you try to do away with the economic system in the United States, you failed right there, and that's when the conversation started. But you can switch it up and make it a win-win discussion for everybody, and if you get the right people in the conversation.
Thank you. That's promising. I hope we can benefit from that, and especially California. I think they could definitely learn from these practices. Do we have time for one more question? Anyone?
One more, says Mike. Anyone got one?
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. This has definitely been an epic panel. I really appreciate this. Thank you to the Center for Humanities for dedicating this year to trees and for allowing us to have this amazing eclectic panel tonight with Western legal traditions as well as indigenous traditions. And it really is a very good snapshot of the systems we have in the United States in dealing with trees and forests. And it looks like we have a lot to learn too. So thank you all for this, and thank you to my co-moderator.
Thank you, Vickie, for bringing these great speakers in. Really was a wonderful lesson, and I think I thought it was pretty clear the direction we need to go as that kind of sifted out of the presentations that were made. But I hope y'all come back for our last meeting on Earth Day, where we'll talk about urban forests and urban trees and wrap this thing up. But thanks so much to our panelists and to our audience tonight.
Exactly.
Thank you.
On behalf of
Thanks
the
for having us.
Humanities Center, I'd love to thank again Blake and Keith and Bill for your presentations, and to Vickie and Bruce for putting this this evening together and for moderating. Thank you so much. And we'll see you back on the 22nd on Earth Day. Have a good night.
Night.
Very good.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks a
everyone.
lot.
Nice meeting you, Bill.